I want to just give a shout out to Dan, who has been volunteering to record the sessions today. Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it, and I know it's a lot of work. Okay, now we're going to hear from Darrel Dexter. Darrel was born in Cairo and raised in Ulin. He holds degrees from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and Southeast Missouri State University. Recently retired from teaching at Egyptian High School in Tams. He lives near Jonesboro. He received the Illinois State Historical Society's Olive Foster History Teacher of the Year Award in 2011 and was selected to participate in workshops supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities at Yale and Colgate Universities. He's the author, editor, or compiler of 33 books on Illinois history and genealogy, including Pulling Off the Sheets, The Second Ku Klux Klan in Deep Southern Illinois, Bondage in Egypt, Slavery in Southern Illinois, and A Trot Down to Egypt, the Lincoln-Douglas Debate in Jonesboro, Illinois. His presentation is called Famous Visitors to Cairo. Please welcome Darrel Dexter.
Can you hear me? Does this work? All right. Cairo, Illinois really stands out in the region of Southern Illinois, mainly because of its placement at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi River. That historic confluence has attracted people for hundreds, and I would definitely say thousands of years. People have come to this site just to see where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers converge. Cairo has a population today of about 1,600 people, but at its peak in 1920, 15,000 people lived here in Cairo. And famous people have come through Cairo, as well as the infamous have come to Cairo. So what I'm going to do today is recognize some of those famous individuals that you will all recognize, I hope, who came here to Cairo, Illinois. So the way this works, it's very interactive, so I hope you can all see the board, and I will show you a picture of an individual and give you a few seconds to try to name who that person is. So we can be very informal here. I have a couple former history students I'm going to rely on. And not to put her on the spot, but I know we have a former history teacher here as well.
Gotta get a little closer, I can't see that.
Can everybody see well enough? All right. I feel like a pastor of a church where everybody sits on the back pew. All right, let's go ahead and begin. It was difficult because I compiled this list and came up with over 75 individuals who I think you will readily recognize, but considering the time allotment, I narrowed it down to about 20 people. So let's start with this first one.
Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln, thank you. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was the 16th, they'll get a little harder as we go. The 16th president of the United States. He was president during the American Civil War. When he was 19 years old, Abraham Lincoln was hired to get on a flatboat and come down the Mississippi River on his way to New Orleans. And while he was in New Orleans, we know from his biographer that Abraham Lincoln witnessed a slave market. And he said from that point on that he was not an abolitionist, but he said, I hate slavery as much as any abolitionist. He also made a similar trip in 1831, and of course, the city of Cairo didn't exist that early, but in 1828, the same time he made his first trip, William and Thompson Bird, who owned the land at the point, put up the first building in Cairo. It was a store slash tavern, and it was intended to attract people that were going up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. I can't document with certainty that Abraham Lincoln stopped at Cairo, but I know he went by there. Most people stopped in at Cairo during that time period as they went down and then back up. Barack Obama. Barack Obama, of course, was a United States Senator from Illinois and the 44th President of the United States. He visited Cairo in 2006, and he came to Cairo as a state representative, actually, I think at that time, and was announcing investment of funds in the biodiesel industry. And it was thought that that would bring a lot of jobs, increase in jobs, to Bunge Corporation in particular, which was and still is located here in Cairo. I included all of these together for time, and also because they all came together. This is, of course, William Jefferson Clinton, or Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, and then the 42nd President of the United States. He served as president during the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. Whether you agree with his politics or not, that's really a matter of historic record. Now, his affair with Monica Lewinsky kind of tainted his legacy just a little bit, but he came to Cairo and visited on August 30, 1996. Some of you, I'm sure, were in the crowd. Egyptian school, where I taught high school, that band played for President Clinton. And then also coming with him, of course, was his wife, Hillary Clinton. She was First Lady. She was, strangely, she was a Goldwater girl. Barry Goldwater was a very right-wing conservative. And as a young girl, high school student, she was a Goldwater girl who would, whenever he would make appearances, the Goldwater girls would come out and do a cheer or something like that to create interest. I guess Bill Clinton, when she met him, he kind of converted her to the other side, and she ran for president. Of course, even though she received 2.9 million more votes than her opponent, she was not elected because she lost in the Electoral College. Same thing is true of the vice president, that's Al Gore. Al Gore, of course, was vice president for Clinton, and then also ran for president. He received 540,000 more votes than his opponent, but lost in the Electoral College. See kind of a pattern here, maybe. Ulysses S. Grant. Probably no president is closer associated with Cairo and the history of Cairo than Ulysses S. Grant, who later became the 18th President of the United States. This is a photograph of Grant that was taken actually here in Cairo. And notice his beard that goes way down. He had this photograph taken, and when his wife Julia came to Cairo to spend time with him, she suggested that he cut it, which he did cut quite a bit of it off. But the photograph itself was taken at Cairo. He, of course, was a colonel when he first came to Cairo. He was a colonel and then was promoted to general while he was here at Cairo. His headquarters were at the St. Charles, later called the Halliday Hotel in Cairo. And he only stayed there, though, for about a week. And then he found better living quarters, and this is also where his wife Julia and son stayed, at the City National Bank, which was located at 609 Ohio Levee. Unfortunately, that building is no longer standing. Whenever he was here in Cairo, he wrote to his wife, Julia, and he said, quote, "Cairo was not half so unpleasant a place as I supposed it would be. I have a nice office and I live with members of my staff immediately back of it." He came to Cairo. The Custom House Museum was built and funded while he was president, but he came back to Cairo in 1880. Was invited to come back. This time he arrived by train, and he was given a grand reception at the Magnolia Manor. Many of you have probably been there before. They had fireworks for him. They had a big ball or dance at the St. Charles Hotel that evening. And this is what he said when he came here to Cairo for the second visit. He said, "When I last was with you, my friends, your little city was a camp of bristling bayonets. You are now in the full enjoyment of the pursuits of peace, a thrifty, promising little city."
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt, yes. Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt is also the youngest person to ever be president. And people say, oh no, that was John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the youngest to ever be elected president. Teddy Roosevelt became president. He was vice president. He was the youngest to ever serve as president, and he did that at the age of 42. He was a hero of the Spanish-American War. The Rough Riders became well known, and really that being a military hero helped propel him into the White House. He was able to take San Juan Hill, which is what he's famous for, only because there were 1,200 so-called Buffalo Soldiers or African American soldiers that helped them make it up to that hill. He also was the first president to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize, and he also, for some reason, historians still debate, got his face carved on Mount Rushmore. Some people scratch their head and wonder why. But the person responsible for picking those presidents really was a big fan of Teddy Roosevelt. He came here in 1907 when he was taking a tour of the Mississippi River, and he came to promote government and private investment in America's river highway, the Mississippi River. And he was taking a tour. He was taken by carriage at St. Mary's Park, where he made a speech, and the Cairo Bulletin, the newspaper here in town, or one of them, the headline across the front page was "President Roosevelt gorgeously received. Most impressive event in Cairo history." Andrew Jackson. If I'd put a $20 bill up there, everybody probably would have guessed it. He was the 7th president of the United States, and ironically, he's seen as the president that really furthered America closest to democracy. And I say that's ironic because he was a slaveholder as well as being a big proponent of Indian removal. But while he was president, more poor white people entered into politics and were able to vote as property restrictions and land requirement ownership restrictions for voting was ended. And while he was president, it's called the era of the common man. He was here during the War of 1812. This is before the city of Cairo was established. But he was here. He left Nashville, Tennessee with soldiers, the Tennessee militia, and they were going to go up and then go down the Mississippi River. to be engaged in battle. He had 1,500 militiamen with him, and they remained at the Confluence site for 3 days. Why? Because the river was blocked because of ice on the river. Same thing happened when the Cherokee were removed a few decades later. Taft, William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States, and the only president that served not only as president, but as later Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And he was Chief Justice from 1921 to his death in 1930. Of course, he weighed 330 pounds. And the one thing people often remember about President Taft was the one embarrassing moment of his life when he got stuck in the White House bathtub and had to call 6 aides to come and help oil him up so they could pry him out of the bathtub at the White House. He came to Cairo on a ship. He came by ship called the Oleander, and it's estimated that probably 25,000 people came to Cairo to hear him speak. The other interesting thing about his visit is that entourage on that ship, or that riverboat, there was the president, the vice president, 100 members of Congress, 25 state governors, not mentioning state legislatures. And he commented in his speech here at Cairo, wouldn't it have been a terrible thing for the country if there had been an accident and that boat would have sunk and all of those people would have lost their lives? Even now, they don't keep everybody together. When the president gives the State of the Union address, they have certain people in the hierarchy located at different places, really for that reason, so there won't be a problem. He said, and when he came to Cairo, he said, "And I can only ask you to accept from me as an evidence of my gratitude for my pleasure over this welcome, my heartfelt thanks and my wish for the growth and prosperity of Cairo, to that which she deserves, situated at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River." He spoke at the same spot where Roosevelt had spoke, in the same spot from which Grant had left Cairo with his troops for the invasion of the South during the Civil War. This one's a little harder.
Andrew Johnson.
Andrew Johnson, it is. Andrew Johnson became president, 17th president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln did kind of a strange thing. It seems strange to us today. But when he ran for president the second time, he was a Republican and he chose a Democrat as his running mate. So when he was assassinated, a Democrat became president of the United States, and the Congress was controlled by Republicans, who found it very difficult to get anything done because he kept vetoing. President Johnson vetoed 71 bills, more than any other president before or since that were placed. 71% of all the bills that were placed on his desk. W.M. Williams, Captain Williams, who lived here in Cairo and wrote a lot of early things about Cairo, said, quote, "Andrew Johnson has always been a friend of Cairo, and he fully appreciated the courtesies he often received in the historic block of Cairo." I don't know what that means, but it's an interesting quote. Andrew Johnson is seen as probably, if not the worst president we've ever had, one of the worst.
Harrison Pierce.
Good guesses, but this is Zachary Taylor, who was the 12th president of the United States. He died in office in 1850. He was a U.S. general during the Mexican War, and being successful in war also helped propel him into the White House. When he was elected president, he came up a riverboat from his home in Baton Rouge up the Mississippi River, and then was going up the Ohio River on his way to inauguration in Washington, D.C. He arrived at 3 a.m., 3 o'clock in the morning, and the people fired the city's cannon, but he didn't come out and speak. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, so we'll give him a break.
Yeah, little guy.
He's known as a little giant.
Yeah, little giant.
And he's also known as Stephen A. Douglas. And Stephen A. Douglas often visited Cairo. I know of 3 or actually 4 times that I can document that he was here. He was the United States Senator from Illinois, presidential candidate, and on 3 occasions didn't win the election. He, of course, ran against Abraham Lincoln in the Senate election in 1858. That's when he came here to Cairo and spent the night. And then the famous debate was held, of course, in Jonesboro. But he came by riverboat, stopped at Cairo, spent the night in the Taylor House, a luxurious hotel in Cairo, later the site of the St. Charles. Or close to it, rather. He stayed there. They had a big party for him in Cairo, and he went up to his room, and his wife stayed down and danced the night away till about 3 a.m. And then they went by train up to Anna, and then across to Jonesboro for the debate. He also came later in 1858, and he came, and he again was on a riverboat. His wife came out because the people heard he was in town. And so his wife came out and said, "I'm sorry, my husband is too hoarse. He's not able to speak. He would like to come out and greet you, but he's not feeling well." Stephen A. Douglas died of throat cancer just a couple years later. And I've often wondered if that wasn't maybe the beginnings, that hoarseness in his voice, if that maybe wasn't the beginning of that.
McClellan.
Yes, George B. McClellan, commander of the Union Army in the East during the Civil War, Democrat candidate for president in 1864 against Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln went to bed the night of the election thinking he wasn't going to win. He thought McClellan was going to win, and then when the results and the votes were counted, probably because of Sherman's successes in Atlanta just a few days before, Abraham Lincoln was reelected president. George B. McClellan was the vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad, and he came to Cairo to inspect the levees. And the levees, which were built by the Illinois Central, broke on June 12, 1858, and a man came riding into downtown Cairo on horseback, yelling and screaming as loud as he can. The levees broke and everybody run for your life. And the water just flooded in and flooded Cairo in 1858. He also accompanied Stephen A. Douglas when he came back, and he was assigned here in Cairo during the Civil War. This is Charles Dickens. There was a presentation going on in the library that I missed. I'm definitely going to watch it on the video about the connection between Charles Dickens and Cairo. Charles Dickens wrote books like Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, and other classics. He visited America and came to Cairo in 1842. And he just stayed on a riverboat in Cairo. It had pulled in and stopped. He stayed here a few hours, and he wrote the notorious comment about Cairo, which everybody has heard. He said, quote, "Cairo is a breeding place of fever, ague, and death, a place without one single quality in earth or air or water, such as the dismal Cairo." And people read that all over the world. That's the beginning of a lot of negative publicity that came out of Cairo. As a matter of fact, when he wrote a less well-known book, The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, he based that fictitious side of the book, a town called Eden, he based that on his perception of Cairo, Illinois. Most people just leave it at that and say, oh, that darn Charles Dickens. Why did he have to say anything? I mean, he was only here for a short time. What a lot of people don't know is Charles Dickens made another visit. And in 1867, he came back to America, and he traveled all over the country and would read excerpts from his book. And when he accepted the invitation to speak here in Cairo, February 3rd, 1868, he was going to speak at a house called the Athenaeum in Cairo down by the levee. He said, will accept the invitation and, quote, he said, "I will make ample amends for all the damage he may have done in the past by his comments about Cairo." But once the rumors out there and the bad words out there, people don't want to hear a retraction. And it's the same way today. Mark Twain. Of course, Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. He was a riverboat pilot, made several visits to Cairo, Illinois. And somebody that was with him when he came to Cairo, and Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain was working as a pilot, and this man's name was Grant Marsh. And he said, quote, "Sam was one of the nicest behaved young men I ever saw, but a poor pilot never turned a wheel. I know he actually went threadbare for months at a time in order to send money to his mother and sister, whom he has supported. He was too nice of a man to ever be a pilot." And I read that and I thought, well, I thought he was a great pilot. And here he said he was a poor one. But when I read it again, I realized he was saying he was a poor man. He didn't even have money to buy clothes for himself because he was sending all of his money back to support his mother and sister. Of course, he came back to Cairo, Illinois in 1882. And he said this about Cairo in his book, Life on the Mississippi. He said, "Cairo is a brisk town now and is substantially built and has a city look about it, which is noticeably in contrast to its former estate, as per Mr. Dickens' portrait of it. However, it was already building with bricks when I had seen it last, which was when Colonel, now General Grant, was drilling his command here. Cairo has a heavy railroad and river trade, and her situations at the junction of the two rivers is so advantageous that she cannot help but prosper."
Langston Hughes.
Langston Hughes, who Mr. Patton mentioned earlier in his presentation. And as promised, I'll tell you a little bit about Langston Hughes. He's a poet, a playwright, a novelist, part of the Harlem Renaissance, probably the best known representative to come out of the Harlem Renaissance in the early 1900s. He was also a reporter or columnist for a newspaper in Chicago called the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper, and he was featured in that newspaper when he wrote about his trip to Cairo in May of 1954. And he came to Cairo, he said, just out of curiosity. He had always heard about Cairo, but he'd never been to Cairo. And he said he came here because he had read about what was going on in Cairo in the 1950s. And he read about a lawyer, a white lawyer from Cairo called David Langston, who was representing the NAACP in their efforts to get equal pay for black teachers and white teachers. And if you know about that incident, the person that lived next to Mr. Langston put up a neon sign and arrow pointing to Mr. Langston's house so that people that wanted to throw rocks and dynamite would know where to land their target. And as a matter of fact, when Langston Hughes came to Cairo, he drove by that house, or he was in a car that drove by. And somebody came, he said, out around him very fast and threw rocks at Langston's house. And Langston came out thinking that the car Langston Hughes was in was where those rocks had come from. And he came out mad and yelling, and they had to explain to him it wasn't them, but it was someone in a car unknown that had gone off. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, became a freedom seeker. Those of you who are former students, we read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. He was expected to come to Cairo to speak first in 1867 at the Athenaeum Theater down by the Ohio River. And the newspaper said this about that visit. He said the Republicans, and this was a Democrat newspaper, the Republicans of Cairo owe it to themselves and their party to give their distinguished champion and leader a reception worthy of the man and the great hour that brings him among them. Among the radical leaders of Southern Illinois, Frederick Douglass stands up a very giant in intellect and decency, and we bespeak for him a full house and a respectful hearing. He also was invited back to Cairo in 1874. He came through Cairo in 1874, and he was coming from Washington, D.C. with the first black governor of Louisiana, Governor Pinchback, and they passed through Cairo. He was invited to come back in 1876 to speak on behalf of the AME Church. And they were going to sell tickets, hoping to decrease or eliminate the church's debt. And he had to postpone that visit until January of 1877. One connection that people from Cairo will find interesting is that Frederick Douglass had a niece. And that niece was named Florence Sprague. And Florence Sprague was married to Dr. William H. Fields, who was a black doctor in Cairo and in Mound City. And she was the niece of Frederick Douglass. And she's buried in Beechwood Cemetery in Mounds, Illinois. Jefferson Davis, best remembered as the president of the Confederate States. He also was married to a daughter of Zachary Taylor, who had visited Cairo earlier. They passed through Cairo on a steamer called the Richmond and didn't get a lot of stir. As a matter of fact, the newspaper said, "We hope people won't give him a reception. He kind of wants to come in incognito and go out." But he came back in 1881 as well. And the newspaper, the Cairo Daily Bulletin, said Honorable Jefferson Davis passed through the city on his way south from Chicago. He will start soon for Europe. He went on to say that he came to Cairo looking for someone who he had previously enslaved, his old caregiver. And he didn't say previous slave, he called her a former servant, which is code word for enslaved. Her name was Betsy Younger, and she lived here in Cairo, but she passed away just a few weeks before Jefferson Davis arrived.
Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, of course, is known as one of the founders of the NAACP and probably best known for her crusade against lynching in this country. She first came to Cairo in 1909 to investigate the lynching of Will Froggy James, which had happened at 612 12th Street. I'm sorry, no. She spent the night at 612 12th Street here in Cairo and then spoke at St. Michael's Episcopal Church Hall, which is on 14th Street. People know about that visit, but they're less likely to know about her second trip. She came in 1924 during the height of Ku Klux Klan recruitment in Southern Illinois. And she spoke at Sumner High School here in Cairo for one night. These are women's rights leaders. Susan B. Anthony, the one at the top, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony came in 1877 and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1870 to speak. Susan B. Anthony, of course, was a leader of the women's suffrage movement and was first arrested for voting in 1872. Sometimes the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, not ratified until 1920, that amendment is sometimes called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. She also spoke at the Athenaeum Theater, and she spoke on women and the 16th Amendment. That was in 1877 because the amendment had been passed and promoted to the states, but it took decades to actually be ratified. She was hoping it would be the 16th Amendment, but it wasn't until 1920 that it was ratified. Stanton also came to speak about women's rights in 1870, and she came at the invitation of the Young Men's Christian Association here in Cairo. These two women, less known. The one at the top is a woman named Mother Jones, and the woman at the bottom is Carrie Nation. And Mary Harris, or as she's better known, Mother Jones, was labeled the most dangerous woman in America because of her success in organizing miners and unions. Her entire family died in a yellow fever epidemic. She lost everything she owned in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, but she kept coming back. She addressed working men here in Cairo with their wives at Carpenter's Hall, which was above Pettit's Racket Store, which is on Washington, or was on Washington Avenue. Carrie Nation, of course, is best known as a temperance movement leader, and she would go into saloons with other women carrying hatchets, and they would just start breaking bottles and breaking open the kegs. She was a radical member. She called herself a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. She spoke in Cairo at Washington Park. She spoke for 30 minutes. She held up her Bible and she said, "This is the hatchet that I'm going to use to smash the saloon industry in Cairo." She said, "Here in Cairo, I've been in jail 25 times. I have stripes on my back from lashes from whips, and I have a wrist that was broken." But she wouldn't be silenced. She came in, and this was the way she operated. She would come into town, and then she would be gone. She would come uninvited. And then she would make her speech. Here in Cairo, she turned a bench over, stood up on the bench and talked, and then she was out of town. She came back to Cairo 2 days later and spoke against what she called the tobacco habit. And she spoke at what was called Halliday Park, which is where the Hughes statue is located, if you're familiar with that. How much time am I running? 5 minutes, all right, I'll make it. Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was an American civil rights leader. A lawsuit was started in Cairo by black teachers suing for equal pay for white teachers. And the NAACP provided a lawyer for that. And Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer. He came to Cairo. And this is what Hattie Kendrick said about Thurgood Marshall's visit. She said, quote, "Thurgood and his other attorney were being called boy by the defense attorney. He went on about how only a brilliant attorney like the one who had won a case like this down in Tennessee could win this one. And after that attorney was finished, he sat down. Thurgood got up, bowed to him, thanked him, and said, 'I am that qualified, brilliant attorney who handled that case.'" And the whole courtroom burst into laughter. John Lewis, and of course Jesse Jackson. John Lewis has already been spoken about if you saw those presentations. He's of course one of the founders of SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he was one of the leaders of the march from Selma to Montgomery, and participated in Bloody Sunday in 1965. He spent a lot of the summer of 1962 in Cairo, and of course had training meetings at Ward Chapel, AME Church, which those of you on the tour were able to see. Jesse Jackson also came to Cairo. Jesse Jackson was a civil rights leader, is a civil rights leader, and was present with Martin Luther King at his assassination in Memphis in 1968. He founded a political organization called the Rainbow Coalition, ran for president in 1984, but did not get his party's nomination. He visited Cairo in 1969 and led a march against hunger with about 2,000 people from Cairo City Hall, and they marched to Pyramid Courts. All right, so why did so many famous people come to Cairo? What is unique about Cairo? Well, as I said in the beginning, a lot of it is simply its location. At the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River. That's what brought a lot of people here in the early 1800s. Travelers on their way to larger cities in the Mississippi Valley, St. Louis, Memphis, New Orleans, stopped in Cairo. Like Mr. Swinson said earlier in his presentation, the riverboats needed to stop to cool the boilers off. Some people got off the riverboats, some didn't. There also is a convergence in Cairo, or was, of about a half dozen different railroads that came into Cairo. And people traveling from Chicago and New Orleans would stop on the Illinois Central and other railroads. Emmett Till, in his travel from Chicago south and then back again, passed through Cairo. The Athenaeum was also a place where people were provided an opportunity to speak. And the Athenaeum, unfortunately, is gone. We can't even find, or I can't, hopefully Don will one day, find photographs of the Athenaeum. It's on the east side of Commercial Avenue near 7th Street. It was built during the Civil War as a place Civil War soldiers could be entertained. It had a balcony for a band. And then later, the Opera House, pictured in the middle, very luxurious, could seat hundreds of people. There were places where individuals who wanted to speak would have a place to speak. And there were very active churches and community clubs and organizations that invited these people to come and speak, such as at AME, Ward Chapel, AME Church. So I'm going to leave you with a quote that was on the first slide or second slide, not by a very famous man, a minister named Reverend William Barton. And he said this: "Whenever we find ourselves able to live where great men have trodden and not feel a sense of exhilaration, then we have permitted something very precious to die within us." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darrel. Any questions for Darrel?
I have an acknowledgement. Darrel has been a very helpful resource for the Cairo Historical Preservation. We applied several nominations to the national parks and Network for Freedom, Ward Chapel. We utilized his book, Slavery in Southern...
Bondage in Egypt.
Yeah. And also I asked him about different resources. So I just want to, I thanked him personally, but I want to thank him publicly for his support. Yeah.
Thank you. All right.
So you've written many books or edited many books, and I'm wondering what got you interested in history in the first place and in the history of this region.
Well, the fact that I was born in Cairo and grew up in Ullen, this is my region, so that's the interest in the region. But I had a grandmother who was born in 1883, and she lived to be in her mid-90s. And I would go home after church because we had church in the morning and we had church at night. So after the morning, I would go home with her and she would fix a meal and we would sit and talk. And she had an old family album. And her father was a Civil War soldier. And so I think that connection with my grandparents reaching that far back, and then in talking with her, I mean, I always liked history, but when I found out my great-grandfather was a Civil War soldier, it became more real and personal. So I had studied, Vicksburg and the siege of Vicksburg in school, but when I found out my great-grandfather was actually there, I became more curious, more interested. So one way I think to get younger people interested in history is let them find that personal connection.
That's a great point,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I wish I had you as a history.
Well, I wish I'd had you as a history student. Not all of my history students are as great as the ones that came out to hear me speak. But yeah.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Did you, you talked about people passing through. Did Dred Scott stop, or there's rumors that, but they never did prove it, that he stayed the night of Thieves, Thieves Courthouse, but did he come through Cairo and stop anywhere?
I don't think any stories about him staying at Thebes. He definitely would have gone by there. Of course, he was stationed in Cape Girardeau for a time as well. Those of you that have eaten at Port Cape, they promote that, as Grant's place. So he definitely would have been by there on his way to St. Louis and back. But as far as actually staying there or sleeping there, I mean, I can't say it's not true, but I've never seen any documentation that would support that.
And just as a point of interest, there was a T.J. Hunt and T.J. Nunn that ran a underground railroad out of Missouri, and he was a preacher in Cairo and Mounds, and he was the grandfather of Charles Hamilton Houston,
Yes.
who trained Thurgood Marshall.
And Don Patton has educated me on that story. I didn't know about that story before talking to him. But there were others. George Burroughs, who was an Underground Railroad agent for the Underground Railroad. He was a porter on the Illinois Central. And I was among the speakers who promoted that for the Looking for Lincoln and the Underground Railroad exhibits. And due to budget cuts, unfortunately, that's been axed. And so it's important that we restore, whether it's from private sources, corporation grants, but money to good projects like this and what's going on in Cairo needs to come from somewhere. If the government isn't or can't do it, then other people need to step up and do it. So if we have any millionaires,
Still looking for money here. Yeah, exactly.
thank you
There was one
again.
question over there.
Just curious, I haven't heard it mentioned in this room today. So on the Kentucky side, just across the river, people are still trying to find Fort Jefferson. I'm wondering what historians in this room has to say about that. Is that real?
Well, I can tell you only this, that when they built Fort Jefferson, the original intent was to build it at what's now Cairo, at the Confluence. And then they changed to the Kentucky side. As far as locating that, archaeologists could probably explain why that's difficult better than I can. But I do know Fort Defiance isn't at Fort Defiance Park.
Right.
It's actually
Right.
north of that.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's difficult, because rivers change, and a part of Cairo is actually, I think, maybe even in Kentucky now, because rivers have changed and boundaries have changed. So it would be difficult to do, locating that site. But I think archaeologists, should be able to do that. Although also whenever it's close to the river, I have friends that said, even here in Cairo, knowing where the site is because of flooding outside of the levee system and walls, that it kind of muddies the water, so to speak, as far as excavations. Yeah. Yes.
As far as famous visitors, you didn't mention the Big Muddy Monster.
I did not.
He's,
You can go to
supposedly-
Murfreesboro and see a statue of the Big Muddy Monster.
Well, he was supposedly seen though on the Cairo levee.
Huh. I won't dispute your word.
Well, I didn't see him.
I'm not too sure how sober that person was.
Thank you so much.